Hi, everyone. So it is such a deep honor and privilege that Chris McNulty, otherwise known as Chris McNutty, as he introduced himself as, actually, at his first presentation in Brian's class several years ago now, has asked me to do this. And and so I've been Mercury retrograding ever since about all of the experiences that we have shared together, and and trying to be mindful of my loquaciousness and how much I just want to gush all over you for the entirety of your talk, because you're so amazing. So I'm gonna try to exercise some discipline here, but I think we all know two things about Chris. First and foremost, that he is an integral genius, and secondly, and I think for me most importantly, he embodies such a Jupiterian glow and an integration of Eros and Logos like few people I've ever encountered. And I really admire, and I feel so blessed to witness his evolution. I remember you asking me to look at your chart on Bart on the way to a Miyazaki film one night. He's also really cool in terms of outside interests too, if you ever want to go to ecstatic dance or gay pride or any number of things. Or if you need somebody to help you move your bed and all of your belongings up 4 flights of stairs twice in a month. Yeah, so just a couple more plugs there for you as a person. And I totally forget where I was going. Oh, that he has what's called a finger of God in his chart, otherwise known as a yod. And he was like, what do you think about that? And I was like, well, you definitely have all the energy down except for the Pluto. You should be my friend. So so our friendship really deepened and developed from there. And I really see, and I'm excited to hear today about how he's bringing his really extensive knowledge and synthesis of both the history of consciousness and science and psychology and a little bit of neuroscience into the body. So lastly, he was feeling a little nervous right before, so I said, you know what helps with that, speaking of neuroscience? 20-second hug releases the oxytocin. And so we did that, and I said, everybody loves you. And he said, I love everybody. And I was like, that's Chris. Okay, no.
Wow, okay. Hello. A lot to live up to in that. Okay, so my topic is Phenomenological Cosmology, or I am the universe and so can you, which for those who don't know is definitely a Colbertianism taken from his book, I Am America and So Can You, but don't want to claim that for myself. But the presentation I was going to give has definitely changed a lot since coming to Esalen. Just kind of trying to work out the concept, because I always get caught up in concepts very readily, and I just think about them and just kind of let them circle. And this week I've really been trying to figure out how to take those concepts through conversations with many of you and to bring that into my phenomenological understanding of how I am in the world. So this is the presentation I was going to give, plus my attempt at integrating that through the concept, which is actually the topic of my conversation. Okay, talk about presentational immediacy. Throwing a phenomenological joke. Okay, so the way that I have sort of approached these two areas of study in an attempt to integrate them into some way, shape, or form through the way that I usually go about things, which is through the concept and trying to use that concept and to relate it to how I go about doing what I do when I'm doing it, living in my life world per se. And the tension that I see, or the dichotomy that I see between phenomenology and our understanding of scientific cosmology is this question of origins. Where does meaning and our mode of trying to understand the world and ourselves originate. Phenomenology gives us the sense that meaning is just present in the way that you go about things. Like when you turn your gaze toward a pencil sitting on the table, you immediately have a meaning based on your history of understanding writing utensils of that is a pencil. And then that's given to you. And then when you start to think about it, you realize that this is an object and you kind of play with it after the meaning has been presented to you. And that's kind of where you can start thinking about how you're relating to this phenomena in your presence. Whereas scientific cosmology tells us that the origin of meaning and the origin of us and the origin of the universe occurred 13.7 billion years ago in linear time. And so phenomenology is giving us the sense that the origin of you, differentiated between the world and unified in the world, happens in this here-now moment. And scientific cosmology throws that origination of meaning into this there-when. It's away from you. Like the meaning has been developing all this time before you emerge into your moment. And that meaning is given to you through authorities and through the way that you move in the world. That's scientific understanding anyway. So when I think about these things, when I think about these things, I want to honor both of them simultaneously without letting one collapse into the other. Because you can think about the origins phenomenologically and just kind of sit with that and play with it. But you can also think of the origins scientifically. And how do you hold those in some dynamic tension where both are honored? And how do you think about these things? So in that regard, I've been reading Stephen M. Rosen, The Self-Evolving Cosmos, and he uses phenomenology to resolve some of the paradoxes in scientific cosmology, the unification program of scientific cosmology of trying to figure out how the very large and the very small are unified. And it's something new to me, so I'm going to present sort of his very basic ideas and then sort of enter into the meditations that I've been doing with them. And by the way, the cat, as a representative of the here now, is I came across that image. I was like, oh, here now. When you're in relation to a cat, which I've been thinking about a lot since he was lost and found while I've been here, my cat. When you see your cat looking at you, you have an immediate relationship. And then if you continue to study your cat, you start to, see his inner dialogue. Like, I don't know if anyone has seen these existentialist cat YouTube videos where like the cat's just kind of playing around the house, just being like, oh, my owner comes and goes. like he brings me water and then leaves, and I am left to drink. And like these kind of things like that, and then you start to build this inner dialogue that your cat is having, and then you start to realize how he's going about his world. Like James talks about learning how to, like squirrelness. And phenomenologically, I feel like that's how that interrelationship occurs between you and another being, or you and another object that you're reflecting on. So anyway, that's why the cat's there. Going into Rosen, the way that he enters into this idea of using phenomenology and cosmology together, he starts with Plato, as so many people do, and he points out that in the Timaeus, Plato laid out this tripartite scientific worldview. It wasn't scientific back then, but it was sort of the origin of the scientific worldview. It was this demarcation between, and here we go, that which becomes, that in which it becomes, and the model which it resembles. And that's sort of how he gets his ideas of eternal forms, which is the model which it resembles, which is the ideas, which is that divine thinking that models reality. And the object is that which changes, and then the model is what you can think about while that object is changing. And the space is just this invariable platform in which it moves, in which the change happens. And this model, this Platonic model, has retained itself into the scientific understanding of the world. Oh, sorry, that's a little fast. Through the idea of subject, object, and space. Like the scientist, the classic general scientist, who studies the world, at least in a Newtonian sense, sees the world from a God's eye point of view as these objects that you can study in a space that is uniform, that allows for change to happen, that you can study. And something that Rosen goes into is that even in the Einsteinian revolution, where we see time and space as unified, this tripartite model is still maintained. Einstein relativized the notion of time and space and relationality, but in so doing, he just removed the subject one step further to a fourth dimension, and the subjects that are the ones that are relating to each other just become objects in this time-space manifold. So as we're trying to understand the world around us and enter this unified idea, this grand unified theory of everything, in order to maintain that objectivist stance, you just have to move the subject. And that's just going to continually happen unless you acknowledge the fact that the subject is there. So what I've been dealing with, what I've been meditating on, is this notion of the Klein bottle, which Rosen uses as a symbol for this tripartite understanding, but also as a way of entering into a phenomenological understanding wherein the subject and object and the space in which they occupy are constantly in a dialectic, and it's a moving dialectic. It's not just the static relation between a transcendental observer and the world that he's looking at and the space in which the objects are formed. And the way that he does this, so the Klein bottle is a geometrical figure. This is an actual Klein bottle in three-dimensional space. But to think of the Klein bottle, you could think of it as a three-dimensional Mobius strip. So the bottom here, if you could think of that as the origination point, moves upwards around this way and then encloses itself and then moves back around. So if you can imagine pouring water into the bottom, it would enter through there and coagulate in this space here, and then it can't escape because it is a three-dimensional object. So if you want to think about this continuously, you have to think about it in 4 dimensions. You have to think about if you start at an origination point, you can imagine it sort of evolving through time and then coming back to its starting point, and not actually cutting itself, but producing itself from the bottom in a continual fashion. That cutting right there, where it enters back in through its edge, is actually an effect of trying to present this 4-dimensional object in 3 dimensions, which is a unique way of thinking about the subject-object space idea. So if you look at this object, the way that Rosen talks about it is you have the 3 parts. You have the enclosed object in space, which is that small part. You have the space that contains it, and then you have the subject, which is outside of both. So you can kind of see that tripartite mode of relating to reality in the Klein bottle. But because it is a continuous one-sided object in 4 dimensions, it doesn't have this discontinuity, and they actually flow through each other in a motive way of doing this. So, yeah, and this is what I just said. So you have space, you have the object, and you have the subject. And this mode of it's a mode of relating to the world is the world that I grew up in. I went through classic mainstream education. It was Catholic, Jesuit, and the subject, object, and space worldview is what I was sort of brought up in. And I want to sort of enchant that a little bit. Because for me, that tripartite understanding is really valuable. That's sort of how I came to understand notions of divinity. Like I was this subject in space. The Godhead or God was this father figure off in the distance, and then the space that connected us was, I mean, in a very simple sense, a snow globe. And by reflecting on my relationship to God in this tripartite manner, I came to know myself as an object for Him and got to see Him as an object for me, where we were in a relationship together where we were constantly chasing each other as subject and object. And yeah, so I want to honor that, but I also want to acknowledge the downfalls of that. I mean, that tripartite understanding of me being separate from things and being able to sort of sit in my safe space out here where things just kind of occur in front of me, really informed sort of how I started thinking. I mean, and it's really oppressive. I mean, I didn't come out of the closet till I was 24 because my relationship to God wasn't close enough because I was separated from Him, that I wasn't comfortable understanding that you know, my relationship is authentic in and of itself. So in a sense, I'm trying to queer my lineage by owning it, but also by looking back on it and seeing how through that worldview you can come to this phenomenological understanding of you and world, where there is the distinction, like it has been made, but it's a motive way of thinking. And let's see, what's time like? Okay, so now in a meditative sense, in a way of sort of fanning out, because to me, just thinking about this, I could just think about this all day. But I imagine that it doesn't make a lot of sense to some people who are not so conceptually inclined. So, in an attempt to sort of bring you all into my mode of thinking of how really important this image is to me, this geometrical shape, I've done a lot of meditating on the concept of the Klein bottle and come up with different methods of trying to understand how this flow is occurring. So, let's see. I've got the one that is my favorite because it's very conceptual, is the cosmological Klein bottle, which is sort of what I did my thesis on, although this is new information to me, so this is nowhere in there. But the cosmological Klein bottle, to me, is this transhuman development of science that we learn about in, say, Rick's Passion of the Western Mind, where you get to understand the cultural origins of the mode of looking at the world as object. And that universe that is created in that mode of interaction with the world as objects is produced through the interaction of the mind and the cosmos. And yet that concept is extended backward into time as if it has a really only objective understanding. And if you sort of go through the Klein bottle of subject looking at object, and you realize that the subject is actually flowing into the objects that it's studying and opens up the space in which those objects take place and comes back around, the unattached mind of classical Greek thought and classic scholasticism and Catholic thinking is creating that universe just by contemplating itself, by looking at the object that it is creating and thinking and coming through and coming back around. And what it discovers in its objective discovery of itself is then brought back to bear and origination that takes place in the phenomenology of this transcendental subject is then re-spent through the spin cycle, and it comes back and informs the way that this Godhead is looking at the world, and then is sent back through. Hope that made sense. Probably not. And then I was trying to understand this, say, in terms of an individual who's just contemplating a flower or contemplating a natural object. Like, where is this Klein bottle in there? And in doing that, so what I did was I stood out here, like right before my talk, and just kind of looked out at the ocean and just thought of myself looking out at this ocean. And I picked a point in which I could sort of stabilize my view, and I made that my object. And I viewed that object as a classic sort of separated subject and just looked at it. And then in looking at it, the moving object of this model, because the subject and the space are invariable, they don't move. It's the object that moves in. But by staring at one point and making that stay, the motion of everything around it just became extremely apparent. Like everything around that point was just constantly in flux, which, based on this idea, space doesn't move. But if you just fix your gaze, that object is still, everything else is moving around. And then, if you just kind of allow that to happen and see the flux as somewhat static, you start thinking about how you're interacting with all of this by maintaining your gaze. Because all of the movement is a shared experience between your subject and everything else that's happening around that point. And then you can start to kind of think about your own subjectivity in relation to the space and the object, and it just kind of starts moving. Like the Klein bottle just goes through and through. And then last night, when I was having a really hard time falling asleep, I was thinking archetypally, which is something I am so inspired by, and yet have a hard time just sort of embodying and understanding so readily. But I was thinking about this in terms of the planets and the archetypes. And the image that I came to through the Klein bottle was a movement from the sun, or the solar ego, to Gaia, Earth, through Mercury and Venus. So if you follow me on this, if you start where the subject enters into space and objects, and there's that breaking point, if you kind of imagine that at that breaking point is when the photon leaves the solar ego, which is the subject, and it goes on this journey through this spiraling object, and through the process of this spiral, it goes through Mercury, which is the spiraling thinking, just constantly thinking about thinking and communication. And I know so well because it was just happening to me all day yesterday. And you can get lost there in that sort of left brain loop because you don't have any reference and you're just so caught up in just the fun of moving around. But then you can move on to Venus by acknowledging that through this process of constantly thinking, beauty emerges. And like it's just a radiating beauty that is solid in the flux. But you could get stuck there too, just completely in bliss, like I was yesterday, just staring at Venus. But then to really bring it all home, you have to move through that beauty and come home to Gaia and realize that all of that process was really your ego coming back to the planet Earth to really kind of fill the cycle and bring it back to make it a more holistic view. That was my attempt. That's hard for me. Okay. And then there's a mode of this Klein bottle just being just present in the room. Like this presentation, I consider as being Kleinian. Like me sitting up here talking to you, like all that's really happening is you and me in verse in the space, in which the cosmology of this Klein bottle perspective of contemplation, just kind of creating the object and the subject, and is present in this moment of time. Kind of thinking of Carrie Welch's presentation, where you have a starting point, and then you have an ending point, and then in there is where universes are created. So, I'm going to end it there. Yeah. Yes.
Can you say that last part again?
The last part? When I was thinking this out, it was going to come up a lot more smoothly. I was just going to kind of like come down into the robe. But the Kleinian bottle that's taking place right here, or at least was taking place and is now again taking place, is the relationship between me looking out at all of you and my relationship to everything else here. And through thinking, like finding my point, which is something that Michael likes to bring out, and finding how my consciousness is moving outwards through my understanding of you, creates my presentational space, which is not what I said. But in a nutshell, it was you and me in verse together is what's creating the universe that we're phenomenologically embodying.
Inverse, one word or two words?
Huh?
Inverse is one word.
You and me in verse. In verse? Oh God. It was in verse, like a musical, lyrical, yeah. But I like in verse also. Yeah. Yes. Robert.
Is there anything ontologically prior, more fundamental, or larger as a vessel for subject-object in space?
Something larger for subject and object in space. Something larger for subject and object in space. Is there a fifth
For
dimension?
example, is there time? Is there...
Yeah, well, that's interesting because like time, at least in my understanding through this process, is that time and space are created through this process. So something that helped me think about this was thinking about the light cone of Einsteinian relativity. I hope people can kind of picture that. It's a graph where there's a point, and then there's this emanation upwards and this emanation downwards. And that now moment is right in the middle. And the determination of where time and space emerge is based on the movement of light away from its source. And what determines space is if the light can reach another object in a certain amount of time that makes them spatially present to each other. But what makes it a temporal event is when light can leave an object in space in a sense that they do not connect in a simultaneous or a space-like way. Does that make sense? So that here now in that light cone diagram is, for at least Rosen, is the subject as an object, because that is where everything begins. So it's not a part of the object, because that's the beginning of relating, of where time and space arise. So looking at that point and realizing that is an object, a part of the subject, which is being viewed as an object on a Cartesian plane, the relation between the subject and object is where time and space arise.
If you could just continue another second. So if you're trying to combine the cosmological and the phenomenological, I would have thought you would need a larger or foundational container for the reconciliation.
Well, the foundational container is this view. Like the container, thinking of something as a container is thinking about it in a space, right? So having a larger container to hold the concept is just one remove, right? Using this dialectical understanding, the container is constantly being merged through the subject and the object, right? So you're constantly creating new containers, and those containers are creating new objects, and those objects are creating new subjects.
It's a possessive phenomenology.
It's acknowledging the container as a way of analysis, but also giving that container or denying that container supreme ontological presence by making it something relational.
Sure. I see where you are.
Yes?
Just given your use of the word dialectic and the clearly dialectical and recursive history that you're exploring, in phenomenology, I'm wondering, have you looked at Hegel's phenomenology of spirit?
No, not yet. Phenomenology is something new-ish to me. It's something new that I'm entering into an understanding of, at least. I have a conceptual understanding of it, but actually like understanding it embodied and perceptively is something new to me. So like the whole field of phenomenology is like a whole
Well, the whole field was clearly influenced
world.
by Hegel, but they're actually sort of, they became different streams. But
Yeah,
I think you might find interesting and helpful the phenomenology of spirit, particularly from the beginning, where he's really engaging this relationship of sense certainty in the here and the now. And subject and object, showing how these are co-created unconsciously for most people, but he's trying to give a way of thinking and knowing to raise that to consciousness. So it might be helpful.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Okay. Leave it there. Unless there's another question. Jeremy.
I just have a comment. You were talking yesterday about what you wanted to do in the future. I think what you should do is stick around so we can talk.
Awesome. Okay. I will mark that.